All right, hello and welcome everyone. Um, so today it's not going to be so much myself talking. I have Jules here, who is running the the Society for the Glorification of Savanarola, and so he's going to be telling us about this very important priest from the Renaissance, Savanarola, who went to fight moral corruption in his own day, and who many people think should be canonized. So I'll sort of let Jules take it from here and talk about the society.
Well, it's lovely to be on. So thank you for having us on. Um, yeah, so Savonarola, the Savonarola Society, I founded it in sort of 2020. It had been something I'd been thinking about. It'd been sort of brewing in the back of my mind for a little while because I read a biography of St. Philip Neri by a priest of the Brompton Oratory, so Father Paul Turks. It's called I think it's called Flame of Love. I can't quite remember the name now, but he has a very long and very good chapter in there all about St. Philip Neri's relationship with Savonarola, which I'm sure we'll get into. um, but that sort of inspired me because St. Philip is such an amazing saint. You know, he's called the second apostle of Rome for a reason. Um, and so I got into Savonarola. I did my dissertation on Savonarola and integralism for the end of my undergraduate degree in theology. And so yeah, the last couple of years I've been working on growing it sort of in the background. And this year we've launched the Savonarola project, which we'll no doubt talk about later. And yeah, so that's really the society and its history. We're trying to grow. You know, we've got a good few supporters, a good few members in the Dominican order, outside the Dominican order, priests, tertiaries, lay brothers, what have you. So it's growing. It's very much a work in progress, but we're heading in the right direction. Yeah.
Yeah. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about who Savanarola even is. Why is this person important to canonize?
Well, all right. So Savonarola is born in 1452. He's born in the city of Ferrara, in sort of northern Italy. Um, his grandfather was a very famous man by the name of Michele Savonarola. He was a doctor, a humanist, an amateur theologian. I'm not going to call him a professional by any means, but he was a very, very well-known, very well-respected physician. He was the physician of the Grand Duke of Padua, and he taught at the university there. And so Savonarola, from an early age, learned to imbibe his values, which were piety, studiousness, a love for Christ, a real devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And it's very clear from sort of his early childhood onwards that Savonarola is taking those lessons to heart. His biographers say, for example, his French biographer Bayonne, who wrote in the sort of 19th century, Bayonne says that he was not given to games with the other children. He preferred recollection and reading and silence. From sort of his time as a toddler onwards, he would prefer to read and to be meditating in silence than to play with the other children, it's nothing unusual for particular souls who have been given those graces, but it's always a very striking reality, as it were, in children. It's a sort of sign of predestination, I suppose. His father, unlike his grandfather, was a sort of middling physician. He ended up a bank manager in Ferrara, not someone of great importance. But from an early age, there was an expectation that Savonarola, that Girolamo Savonarola, would be a doctor, like his grandfather, like his father, and so he started training. He was schooled privately to begin with, in the sort of classical humanist schooling, and then after his grandfather died in 1468, Savonarola was only 16. He then went off to university, where he studied under the professors there, and it was at the University of Ferrara that he began to also have a great love for poetry. So people, I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but people often accuse Savonarola of being a Philistine, of hating the arts, of burning Botticellis, and threatening to murder painters or what have you. But he was a prolific poet. He was a lover of music, and he picked it up at university. He was a devoted follower of Petrarch, for example. He composed many poems in sort of vulgar Italian, the Italian of his time, and in Latin as well, because he was a competent Latinist. So yes, he's at university studying to become a doctor, and then he has a change of heart, and he decides that he wants to become a Dominican friar. And when he's back at home, he packs everything up that he's going to take with him in his backpack, and he runs away in the middle of the night, and he goes to, I think it's to Bologna, and he doesn't tell his parents. He tells not a soul in the world. He runs off, and he knocks on the door, first thing in the morning, and he begs to be admitted into the Dominican order, and he is. So that's sort of 1475. Initially he doesn't want to be a priest. He didn't think his vocation was to be a priest. Initially, he just wanted to be a lay brother, and that did not last. His novice master sort of immediately noticed that he was called to the priestly dignity. So he was ordained just 1 year after entering into the seminary, the novitiate rather. I mean, and it's not extraordinary, but it is still very quick. It's very clearly a sign that God wanted him in the priestly state. But yeah, so he becomes a Dominican. He becomes a priest. And immediately, within 2-3 years, he's made a professor of logic for novices, and sort of Aristotelian philosophy generally. He writes a number of treatises. He writes very famous treatises on logic, for example, at that time. And then he's sent off to Florence for the first time. He's sent off to Ferrara and then to Florence, and then he returns to Bologna to carry on with his study. He goes to Florence for the first time in sort of 1482, because he's supposed to take up the teaching of the novices there. And he has a sort of spell of preaching, and it goes terribly. Everyone thought he sounded foreign. Everyone wanted, complicated sermons filled with quotes from Cicero, and not what Savonarola would give them, which was the scriptures. And so, because there was sermons were seen more as an elite thing, where a rhetorician would come up and exercise his craft, and he would be full of quotes from astrologers and contemporary philosophers or what have you. So he then leaves. He then leaves Florence for the first time. Well, whilst at Florence, he has some visions, but he doesn't talk about them. He doesn't write about them. They're called the San Giorgio visions. He's waiting in a sort of courtyard outside for a friend, and he's reading the scriptures, and suddenly, just in his mind, he hears, here are the 7 reasons that God is going to scourge Italy. And, that heresy, schism, sodomy, that sort of thing. But he doesn't publish them. He writes them down and keeps them secret.
Are these visions influencing what he's preaching about?
So not yet. They will do, but they will do when he comes back to Florence in sort of 1492. So he leaves 1486. He goes off to Ferrara again. He preaches in Bologna. And he had no intention of coming back to Florence, but he comes back in 1490, possibly at the insistence of Giovanni Francesco Pico della Mirandola, the very famous sort of Neoplatonist humanist scholar. Pico was, to put it lightly, in trouble in 1490. So he'd published his very famous 900 theses, and he'd expected them to get a good reception, and they got not a good reception. It was filled with theses like the natural religion of men is not Christianity. There is a pure Adamic religion which Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, well, not Hinduism, but paganism are all expressions of. And so it was a sort of highfalutin Neoplatonist sludge of ideas. Yeah. And so I think about 500 of the theses were sort of condemned outright because he sent them to consistory. So he was in a bit of trouble. And he basically was living under the protection of Lorenzo de' Medici, who was the sort of de facto ruler of Florence. Not de jure, because de jure Florence was still technically a republic, as it had always been. But in practice, the Medici had run the city, personally for 2 generations now. And so he comes back in 1490. He becomes the prior of San Marco, of the convent of San Marco, in sort of May, June. We're not quite sure, of 1490. And so that year he preaches his first set of sermons on the first epistle of St. John and on the book of Revelation. And it's the series of sermons on the book of Revelation that start to get him a following. Because he's preaching on damnation, yes, but also he begins, quite early on to speak of the chastisements that are coming for Italy and for faithless Christians. He gets up, in the Duomo. He's preaching basically at Lorenzo's pleasure, and he gets up in the Duomo and he thunders against tyrants. He might as well have just been pointing at Lorenzo de' Medici, who was sort of the quintessential tyrant for the Savanarola. So he starts to grow a following.
When he's commenting upon the book of Revelation here, is he trying to imply like the end of the world is here, or is he saying more this is typological of the sort of judgment that's going to come upon Italy?
Well, yes, it's more the latter. I mean, he certainly emphasizes that we are in the last times, that we are living, through the book of Revelation, however that's going to play out, because, I mean, that is sort of the message of Revelation as accepted by most theologians, that it's for the church in the end times. How each bit applies, we'll find out on the last day. But yeah, he says that, you know, the reign of Antichrist is being hastened because of the sins of Christians and the sins of Italy in particular, the sins of Rome, the sins of Florence, the sins of... but that's nothing new. I mean, St. Bernardine of Siena had been preaching in much the same way, you know, thunderous sermons against moral corruption and vanity and all that sort of thing. So yeah, 1492, he's been in Florence for about 2 years. He's sort of getting a following. So the parties that begin to, they're not political parties as we call them. Florence is ruled by a parliament, by the Signoria, which is a parliament of about 120 people. And they're sort of aristocrats that get elected amongst each other. And the Signoria and sort of Florentine society at large begin to be divided into various factions. So there's Medici partisans, who are first and foremost loyal to the Medici family. There are the Piagnoni, the weepers. So they're called the weepers because they're always crying. They're crying over their sins because they're listening to the sermons of Savanarola, and they're getting, you know, so overwhelmed by the sense of impurities. They're crying all the time. That's how their enemies, who are called, name them, and they, the Piagnoni, in return name their enemies the Arrabbiati, the ragers, the because they're always raging against the friar and his teachings. So things are beginning to get a bit split. He's gaining popularity. He's still gaining popularity. And then in 1492, 93, he preaches a very, very famous sermon called the Renovation Sermon. And he says, there's a very famous line which comes out of it, Ecce gladius Domini, behold the sword of the Lord, you know, may it fall swiftly and fast. He's warning of judgment on Italy, on the church, on, you know, basically everyone. And in 1493, he begins a series of sermons. He prophesies about a new Cyrus, Cyrus the Great, coming from the north. He doesn't identify who it is at that point. That Cyrus is that series of sermons, which don't exist anymore, sadly, but that series of sermons is very important because the next year, the September of the next year, 1494, Charles VIII, King of France, Charles of Anjou, invades Italy at the invitation of the Duke of Milan, who's a very unreputable character, Ludovico Sforza, nicknamed Ludovico the Moor, for his black character. And to put into perspective, this invasion of Charles VIII sets in place around about 60 years of conflict. It's known as the Italian Wars, between France, the Holy Roman Empire, and all the Italian city-states. It's hard to even get the sort of scale of just how much devastation it caused. Machiavelli, we're not big fans of Machiavelli, but Machiavelli says that Charles VIII ruined Italy and he kept her in desolation. So that just shows you, you know, the level of devastation we're talking here. And so Charles VIII invades Italy, and he's supposedly going there to claim Naples. He's supposedly going there to pacify Naples, but really he just wants to come in and cause a bit of a mess and subjugate the Pope and all sorts of things. So by this point, Lorenzo the Magnificent, is dead. and he, having died, he's left his son Piero de' Medici in charge of the Republic. And Piero is a very young man. He's about 16, 17. He is not ready to take on the burdens of government. He's a lesser man than his father was. And so Piero rides out to meet Charles VIII of France. And the Medici were not very popular, even under the reigns of someone like Cosimo or Lorenzo. Florence had been a republic. Florence was very republican, and so there was always a deep dissatisfaction with being sort of subjugated by a foreign dynasty who had established themselves as honorary heads of the government. So Piero goes to meet with Charles. Charles VIII sort of denigrates him, and he comes back to Florence, and there's not much of an agreement made between the French and the Florentines. And so the people of Florence revolt. They expel Piero from the city. They send him packing. He goes off to Rome. And so they then proclaim a renewed republic. They have, all the same institutions as before. The Signoria stays as it is. But Savonarola, because he had been preaching for so long, and because he has been preaching, and he's come out and preached, that he prophesied that the Medici would be expelled from the city. He's taken very seriously, and he's become sort of the spiritual head of the government. He doesn't take office. There's no place for him in day-to-day politics. He's busy being the head of a monastery. He influences the polity through preaching, through encouraging acts of public virtue, through, as we get onto in 1495, 1496, his famous bonfires of the vanities, where he encourages people to burn their vanities in the public square. And so the Republic's been restored in 1495, but rumor reaches Alexander VI, Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia. Rumor reaches Rodrigo Borgia of this friar who is running a government, who is supposedly, the worst of heretics. A lot of Savonarola's rivals had left Florence, and they'd gone to Rome. And so he's getting fed all these rumors, these lies. I mean, they're very much lies. And all of Italy is sort of in a fervor because Savonarola had ridden out and arranged peace for Florence with Charles VIII of France. Now, Alexander had called the Italian League to resist the French invasion, and Florence, under the influence of Savonarola, had refused. And so Alexander, hearing all these things, seeing that Savonarola was refused the invitation to join the Italian League, starts writing to him, and he asks him to come to Rome. He writes and says, you come to Rome, we can discuss your prophecies, we can discuss what's going on with the government. There's no indication that there's a plan to get rid of him at this point or anything. Savonarola replies, he says, I'd love to come to Rome. I can't. I'm very sick. The doctors have said if I go traveling, I'll die. And until the political situation in Florence gets solved, I'm not going to be able to come because I will probably be assassinated as soon as I leave the city. And of course, canon law doesn't require you to obey an order if you're immediately going to be killed for it. So initially that's accepted, and Pope Alexander writes to him and says that's accepted. And then a brief comes out of Rome, a surprise brief that is not delivered to Savonarola. It's not delivered to his convent at San Marco. It's instead delivered to the Franciscan convent in Florence. Now, the Franciscans, I'm very sad to say, had become his sort of number one rivals. They hadn't liked him from the start. The Franciscan, there's always been a bit of Franciscan Dominican rivalry, as well as brotherhood, but in this case, it gets taken to extremes. The Franciscans really didn't like Savonarola, so they have this brief which says that Savonarola is to be suspended, that he's to leave for Rome immediately, otherwise he's excommunicated. And so the Franciscans bring it in sort of a triumphal way to San Marco, and Savonarola writes back to Pope Alexander. He says, "I've already explained to you why I can't come to Rome. I'm not being disobedient. If you want, I'm planning to publish all of my prophecies, all of my sermons, my tracts. I'll send them to you, and you can see I've preached nothing against the teachings of the Church." And Pope Alexander actually sort of steps back. The brief is remitted, and for about a year, Alexander is reported to have said to one of his courtiers, "Tell me nothing about that man. For all I know, he may be a saint." So for about a year, that's how things stand. And then there are more rumors in his ears. There's more exiles. Piero de' Medici is in Florence, and he's very upset, as you would be. There's more rumors. There's more accusations, and so another brief is sent, and Savonarola is suspended from preaching, which he immediately obeys. He stops saying mass publicly. He stops preaching. For about 6 months, when there's again a bit of a relenting, and he's given back the faculties to preach, and so he does. And it's at this point that there's a lot of preaching against clerical corruption, and he preaches a very famous sermon in which he says, if Florence repents, Florence is going to be, a type of the New Jerusalem on earth. It's going to be a golden age for Florence. Florence will be the greatest city of Italy. Rome, on the other hand, Rome is going to be scourged. It's going to be punished for the sins of the bishops, for the sins of the faithful in Italy. And he says he has two visions of two different crosses, one which is gold and one which is red, and the red cross is it's written crux ira Dei, the cross of the wrath of God, and the other one is the crux misericordia Dei, and so the red one will fall first and then the gold one. So this is not taken well in Rome, as you can imagine, nor are his generally unfavorable opinions towards the Pope. He's not Alexander's biggest fan. For a time, Savonarola entertains the notion privately, without publishing it, that Alexander might not have been Pope, simply because he was a simoniac. But it's very important to say that he was always as obedient as he possibly could be. I mean, he very much tried to follow all the proper pathways in canon law to resolve any issues. He writes time and time again to Pope Alexander, as your useless servant, Fra Girolamo. So yes, at this time, there's another issue which pops up, and it's about the convents, the monasteries of the Dominican order. And the Pope says that he wants to merge the Tuscan congregations, so the congregations of which St. Marco was the head, with the Lombard congregations. And Savonarola and his friars refuse, because the Lombard congregations are very well known for being dissolute. They are not really even Christian in the way that they're living. He writes very famously in his Apology for the Brethren of San Marco that these friars, because when it was tradition to go for new novices to go to the tomb of St. Dominic once they'd received the habit and pray on the tomb. And in the Apology for the Brothers of San Marco, he recounts a very famous account that some of these friars went and prayed at the tomb of St. Dominic as usual, and a voice was heard, coming from the tomb, "You are not my sons, and I am not your father." And that should give you a sort of indication of how poorly they were living. And so the Pope sends the now blessed Sebastian Maggi as his representative to try and enforce the whole thing. It comes to an impasse, and Savonarola is excommunicated. There's a brief of excommunication that appears. It says for disobedience, and for disobedience, Savonarola is excommunicated. For a while, he withdraws from public preaching, but then, upon a more thorough examination of the text of the bull and of the accusations in and of itself, he becomes very much convinced that they're invalid, and he preaches a sermon. So he gets up into the Duomo in Florence rather, and he preaches a sermon about how they are not valid, how the excommunication isn't valid, and whoever obeys the excommunication or insists that he obeys it is in fact themselves in sin, because it's to comply with an unjust law is an act of tyranny. It's an act of a grave injustice as well. So you can imagine the political situation. It's tough. It's getting worse. He has serious rivals, and so 1498. It all comes to a head when the Franciscan theologian, when the Franciscans come and they challenge Savonarola to an ordeal by fire, and they say he should walk through the flames with his doctrine, with his writings, and whoever comes out alive is the one favored by God. And Savanarola refuses naturally, but foolishly, one of his fellow friars, Fra Domenico, accepts to do it. And then there's a big rainstorm, and so it's put off. And so a mob gets whipped up. They storm the gates of San Marco. They arrest Savonarola, and he's put in prison. In prison, he's then tortured severely for a number of weeks, for about a month or so. They managed to extract under torture a confession, which he signs, which says he was a heretic, he was a blasphemer, that all of his prophecies were fake, and Savonarola recants, of course, of the signature, and so in his last sort of month, he writes one of his most beautiful works, which is a set of meditations on Psalm 51 and 31, so the Miserere, Psalm 50 rather, which has been set to music by Bird, actually, the In Felix Ego. And so 1498, May 23rd, 1498, he's brought out, he's degraded with his two brothers, Fra Silvestro and Fra Domenico. They are removed from the clerical state, they're hanged, they're burned alive, and that's the end of his life. Yes. So I suppose we can sort of move on to the afterlife, if you want.
Could I ask a few questions about his life first? Yeah, because it's very interesting. you talk a lot about these prophecies and stuff, right? And you often hear this accusation of false prophecies against Savanarola. And that was one of the main things I knew about him before you talk here. But it sounds more like he was talking about a devastation coming upon Italy than necessarily like the complete end of the world. Because if we took that sort of language that he was using as a false prophecy, then just for at least from what you said here, that would sound like a lot of saints have talked in that sort of language. Like I think we can often read that as them talking about whatever's going on in their own day, because devastation did come upon Italy, as you were talking about.
Yes, yes. Well, in truth, there are only a few points where people can quibble about his prophecies. So, I mean, it's very clear that he made accurate prophecies. He prophesied that there would be a scourging of Italy from the north. He prophesied, which would come with Charles V in 1527 when he sacks Rome, takes the Pope prisoner. He prophesies about Martin Luther. He prophesied that there would be a great German heresiarch. He prophesied about the deaths of Lorenzo de Medici, very famously. It's recounted in some of his biographies that it was told to him that Lorenzo could force him to leave Florence, and he replied, "Lorenzo will leave, I will stay." So there are true prophecies that come. So there are a few points where people quibble. So in the Compendium of Revelations, he talks about the conversion of the Muslims and the Turks, and it's fairly clear that in the context of the actual passage, in the context of the actual revelation, he's saying when Florence converts, when Jesus Christ reigns as king in Florence, when all of these good works have been done, when the souls, when Christian souls are devoted to the Christian faith, then and only then will you see the Muslims and the Turks convert. So it's very clear that he prophesied conditionally in that case, and the condition was that they listened to Jesus Christ working through him, or just working generally. But what do? They burn him alive. So it's not a surprise that instead of the renewal of Florence, the renewal of the church, we get devastation, the Crux Ira Dei, the cross of the wrath of God, the Italian wars, just huge devastations right across the nation. And I think people will also pick out bits here and there. So they'll pick out, he prophesied about a new flood. He encouraged the Florentines to build for themselves an ark, as Noah did. But he wasn't actually encouraging them to build an ark because there was going to be a global flood. He was saying, do as Noah did, follow piously God's instructions, and you'll be spared from the deluge of punishments which are coming on the world. So it's either people who deliberately misread some of his prophecies, or who take a sort of fatalistic, fait accompli approach to prophecy, which isn't really the way prophecy works. I mean, if we think of Our Lady of Fatima, for example, 1917, she tells the children at Fatima that if the Pope and all the bishops do the consecration, Russia will be converted. There will not be another war. But if they don't, there will be a second world war, and you'll know it by a light illuminated by a great light. And so it's very clear that when prophecies come down from heaven, they often come down with conditions attached to them. I mean, the prophet Jonah, when he's in Nineveh and he's very upset that the whole thing doesn't get blasted to kingdom come, comes to mind.
Yeah, I was about to mention actually the example of Jonah, because we have, I think, this cultural conception of what the purpose of prophecy is, which is sort of just to tell the future, right? Show you have some sort of divine mandate. Versus it seems in scripture, the purpose of prophecy is usually much more to call people to repentance than it is merely to show some sort of divine mandate. There's many other purposes of prophets in scripture, but actually this divine mandate sort of role of prophecy is a relatively minor one as a whole in scripture. And it's interesting that all these private revelations throughout the tradition look a lot more like biblical prophecy than they do like cultural conceptions of prophecy.
Yes. Yes, I think it's very much the case here. It's very likely that Savanarola, I think, accurately predicted the sack of Rome of 1527, because that fell sort of 29 years in the same month, 29 years after his death, in the same month, the month of May. So just shy of 30 years. I don't think that that's insignificant at all.
Yeah.
So, oh, no.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask about, you said there was a rivalry going on with the Franciscans. You know, this channel, we do a lot of Franciscan stuff. So I was curious if you could expound a little bit more on what they were running into. Because there was, as you mentioned, shortly before Savanarola, there was, what's his name, St. Bernardino, who seems like a very similar sort of figure traveling around Italy, preaching repentance to Italy. And he was a Franciscan.
Yes. Yes. Well, really, the issue was that they were less Franciscan and more Neoplatonist, more humanist. So some of his main rivals were very much creatures of Lorenzo de' Medici. They were very much learned in classical poetry, the poetry of, Ovid, and they preferred to bring that to what they were doing rather than the gospel. They would preach Neoplatonist sermons. They would preach sermons on the eloquence of Homer. They would teach children in the schools to not bother reading St. Paul. And that was the case up and down Italy, that Christian writing, Christian letters, Christian art was sort of disdained for pagan things. And so some of these Franciscan friars were very much creatures of very much pagans in essence, and they weren't good Franciscans by any means. It's notable that, as we'll get onto, there were Franciscans, even contemporary Franciscans, or in the Franciscan family, who had prophecies about Savanarola. So the big one is St. Francis of Paula, who is the founder of the Order of the Minims, who are, I believe, still a Franciscan in the Franciscan family. And he preached sort of about 10, 15 years before Savanarola's death, he prophesied all about what would happen to him. So yeah, they were less Franciscan than they were anything else. They were very much creatures of the culture, creatures of the time, and very much unpleasant. I mean, there's one of them, one of these friars, at the personal invitation of Lorenzo de' Medici, sort of back in 1492, gets up in the Duomo and he preaches not a sermon, but a screed. He just swears and insults and denigrates Savonarola from the sermon from the pulpit of the cathedral. And for that, everyone was disgusted with him, and Lorenzo kicked him out of the city. And of course, where did he go to? Rome. So you can see there was these sorts of people, trying to influence the Holy Father to set him at odds with someone or other.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So yeah, moving on sort of to the afterlife of Savonarola. The question of veneration is something that arises very early on. So St. Philip Neri, he's born the early 1500s. So he's very much just after Savanarola dies 1498. He's very much just after that. He's educated at San Marco. He was educated by the friars of Savonarola's community. And so St. Philip Neri has a deep love for Savonarola. And he takes that with him to Rome when he comes to Rome. Some of the early biographers of St. Philip Neri try to play it down for obvious reasons. I mean, Savonarola was very controversial. He was technically excommunicate and all that. But he has a number of miraculous encounters in his life regarding Savonarola. He would teach in the little oratory from the Triumph of the Cross. He would teach in the little oratory from Savonarola's tracts on confession, on the Mass. And it's said that when he died, he owned 2 sets of books, which was his breviary and the sermons of Savonarola. And he's one of the biggest names out there for saints that venerated Savonarola, but he's certainly not the only one. St. Catherine de' Ricci, who was at Prato, she had visions of Savonarola. Savonarola appeared to her and healed her miraculously of an illness. She saw him in a vision rising up to heaven. She had one of his fingers, which I believe the convent actually still has over at Prato. She had one of his fingers in a reliquary, which she kept and venerated all her life. St. Francis of Paula, as we mentioned before, who was a contemporary, made a very clear prophecy in 1487 in a letter that he wrote. He said, I'll read you it's only a short extract, but St. Francis said, I hear of a most ardent father preacher of charity towards God and towards one's neighbor. He is named Fra Girolamo of Ferrara. This holy father is very zealous for the Catholic faith and for the state of holy religion. He will be envied, hated, falsely accused by the Supreme Pontiff, condemned to death for false wills, and at a false trial, hanged between his 2 companions, and then his body will be burned, and for fear that his relics might be adored by the people, his ashes will be thrown into the Arno River, so that they may not be gathered out of devotion. Some of his devoted followers will have them, and they will perform miracles. That's 1487, 11 years before Savonarola's death. That's pretty clear cut as things go. And the list of saints who had devotion to him goes on and on and on. St. John Fisher, Blessed Osana of Mantua, St. John Fisher, in his book Against Luther, Luther's Babylonian Captivity, says that it's well known that Savonarola taught only the Catholic faith, and never taught heresy. Because unfortunately Luther was a fan, which is silly for a number of reasons. I mean, if Savonarola had lived and gotten his hands on Martin Luther, I'm sure he'd have burned him alive. But yes, and very interestingly, the popes themselves were very pro Savonarola. It depends on the pope, obviously, but across the sort of last 500 years, there have been a number of popes who have personally venerated Savonarola. They've given indulgences for those who visited his cell. So Julius II, who was the successor to Alexander VI, reportedly said that he wanted to canonize him. And in fact, he ordered Raphael, the very famous painter Raphael, to paint him in the Raphael rooms in the Vatican, literally just next door to the Sixtine Chapel. He's there in the very famous Disputation on the Blessed Sacrament. He's sort of next to St. Thomas Aquinas, and that's less than 20 years after he's supposedly been excommunicated for heresy and burned alive. The charges of heresy were dropped. That's one of the miracles of St. Philip Neri, actually. So St. Pius V called a consistory because the Jesuits and the Dominicans were arguing about Savonarola. So whilst there's been many saints who venerated Savonarola, there's been a number who did not like him, and one of them was St. Ignatius of Loyola. St. Ignatius said that all his works should be burned, and so the Jesuits have been against him from the start. Because of their particular emphasis on obedience, they saw him as some sort of proto-Protestant, proto-reformer, which is unfair, but you can't necessarily blame them for seeing it that way. And so this particular examination of his works was called to determine whether he was a heretic. And St. Philip Neri was making the 40 hours devotion with the Dominicans at Santa Sopra Minerva, which is the big Dominican church at Rome, not their headquarters, but one of their main sort of central churches. And he went into ecstasy whilst he was looking at the Blessed Sacrament exposed. He collapsed. He was carried off to a different room, and he didn't want to say anything about it at first. And then he was heard to be shouting, "Victory, victory, Vittoria, Vittoria." And the Dominicans turned to him and said, "What are you shouting about? What's going on?" And he said to them, "My friends, I have had the most wonderful news. Whilst I was praying that, I saw our Lord Jesus Christ present and blessing us from the tabernacle. We have won. We have won the cause." And they bring the news. The news gets brought to them that the consistory had found Savonarola not guilty of heresy. And he'd been found not guilty at the very moment when St. Philip Neri cried out, "Victory, victory," and had this great vision before the Blessed Sacrament. So it's really quite astonishing. Leo X, Pope Leo X, who was himself a Medici, a direct relative of Piero de' Medici and the Medicis and Cosimo and what have you. Pope Leo X personally went to Florence. He personally went to Savonarola's cell, and he prayed there, and he gave a plenary indulgence to anyone who made a pilgrimage to his cell. Pope Paul IV also absolved Savonarola's works from heresy. And this is Paul IV we're talking about. Paul IV, who saw heretics in, left, right, and center in his cupboards and under his bed. Paul IV, yes. Clement VIII, it's cited in Guasti in the proper office, because an office for Savonarola was prepared and published in Italy for the Dominicans there, and it's got propers for all the canonical offices. One version of it has a text from Pope Clement VIII. He said, "I desire to canonize Fra Girolamo Savonarola, and I allow his images to be sold in Rome with the halo and the titles of Blessed, Virgin, Doctor, and Martyr." He was very much respected by Leo XIII. When the statue of there's a statue at Worms, a famous statue of Martin Luther and the predecessors of the Reformation. So it's got Jan Hus, it's got Peter Waldo, those sorts of folks, and then it's got Savonarola on the end. And Leo XIII is reported to have said in private audience that this is not right. Savonarola is ours. Pius XII was greatly devoted to him as well. Venerable Pius XII. He actually personally wrote in the in the newspaper. What's the Vatican newspaper again? It's not La Civiltà Cattolica. It doesn't matter. But he wrote in 1915, he said that Savonarola was, the first example of someone fighting against neo-paganism and an example for our times. And I tend to agree with with Venerable Pius XII. Even up to sort of recent times, Pope Francis, in one of his infamous sort of plain interviews, said that Savonarola was treated too harshly by the church. And so there's a long history of veneration of Savonarola. There's a long history of miracles associated with Savonarola. Fra Bolamaki, who wrote the earliest sort of vita, hagiographical vita, has a collection of about, I think, 35. And there was an addition made to his work which contains another number of miracles, miraculous healings, the punishments from God for certain enemies of the friar. So there's a very solid foundation for venerating Savonarola from immediately after his death up until the present day. I mean, his cause has been taken up at various times. Various popes have said they wanted to canonize him. In 1935, the general chapter of the Dominican order told Fra Benedetto Lenzetti, who was the then person in charge of promoting the causes of the saints for the order, to begin preparatory studies for beatification. And that started. It stalled thanks to the war, obviously. After the war, there were some very good Dominicans who carried on doing work. Fra Scaltriti, for example, Scaltriti's Dialogo sul Savonarola, which was him, Fra Mancini, and Garrigou Lagrange, because there was a bit of a controversy in that Garrigou, in the French edition, the Italian edition, of Garrigou Lagrange is 3 Ages of the Interior Life. There was a passage that his editor had added in, condemning Savonarola as somebody who let their zeal get the better of them. And Fra Scaltriti actually wrote to Garrigou Lagrange and said, "Was this actually you? If so, can I change your mind?" And he said, "Actually, that wasn't me. I didn't put that in there." And in the third letter, which is printed in both French and the Italian, in the Dialogo sul Savonarola, he says, "I'm convinced from what you've told me that we should begin preparatory studies for his beatification." So even, some of the greatest contemporary Dominicans were in favor of the canonization. It stalled really after the council. The interest basically evaporated. And I've talked a lot about this with some of the other people involved in the project, and my theory is essentially that Savonarola was the worst for both sides of the division in the order. So the liberals in the order wanted nothing to do with the bigoted extremist preacher who was preaching fire and brimstone, and I'm sure that, and my thinking is that the conservatives in the order say, "Oh, he's associated with disobedience," whether or not it's true. He's associated with schism and heresy, so we're gonna distance ourselves from that, and we've got other figures to be promoting. But there was a renewed attempt, sort of in the late 90s, 1995. The Archbishop of Florence said that he was very much in favor of doing it. Fra Innocenzo Venchi, who was then the postulator for the causes of Dominican saints, started doing some of the preparatory studies. An initiative for those studies was published in 1999 They carried on. Fra Innocenzo Venchi was then removed from his position in 2003 at the general chapter, and it's not moved since then. He died in 2020. So we're sort of coming into, we're sort of filling in the gap, I suppose. Because there really is an interest in Savonarola, and it's not just, fuddy-duddy old Italians who continue to kiss his statue whenever they come into San Marco. It's very much an international phenomenon, because we run, our Twitter. It's very much an international apostolate. We get messages, we get comments from third order members of the Dominican order in Brazil. We get messages from third order members in Hong Kong. We've gotten priests of the order who are interested. Father Thomas Crean, for example, Father Lawrence Liu. We've had priests, lay brothers, basically everyone who's involved in the order somehow, has come forward and said, I'm interested in this. I have a devotion to Savonarola. And so it's really just sort of giving a voice to that and doing our own part to make him better known in the English-speaking world, because most of his works have never been translated. I mean, even in Italian, they're not easy to find, which is crazy. There was a national edition, so a compilation of all his works, in sort of 25, 30 volumes, called the Opera Nazionale, that was started in the sort of late 40s, finished mid 50s. And that's the standard Italian printing still. I mean, it's been 70 years. It's 80 years now, guys. So yeah, what we're hoping to do as a society is to, advance in whatever way we can the cause. So we're preparing, and this is going to take a very long time, a packet to go to the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. We're hoping to start doing some in-person events, small pilgrimages, that sort of thing. But of course, the big project is the Savonarola project. If I could share my screen, actually, I'll show you all the...
Do you have permission to share screen? Let's see if not,
I don't quite know. Yes.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
Come up. So yeah, the Savanarola project. Our goal is to.
Which I have a link to this Patreon in the description of the video, so everyone can go check it out, as well as your guys' Twitter.
Thank you. So really, what we want to be doing is translating all of Savanarola's works into English, not just some of them, not just compiling them into a sort of general one volume selected writings type thing. Our goal is to publish all the sermons, all of his tracts, all of his spiritual works, all his letters, all his poetry. And it's a big project. It's a very big project. You can see it's 10 volumes of sermons, 4 of theological writings, 1 to 2 volumes of spiritual works, poems, letters. So we do need sort of financial contributions. We've elected to do it through Patreon, because it allows us a bit more freedom. It allows Alex, who's our translator, a bit more freedom. It allows him to still do his day job, whilst giving him that extra bit of cash to help fund, because translation is very expensive. But we've partnered with Libri Sancti Press, who have agreed to publish these volumes when they come out. We're also looking to publish some of the very well-known secondary sources, whether that be Fra Bola Marchi's Vita, or Bayonne's Life of Savonarola, or other English sources, or what have you, because so many good sources, so many critical sources, that have all this information about the saints, the testimonies of these saints, the bishops, the cardinals, the popes. They're not really readily accessible, certainly not in English, and even not so much online. You really have to go looking. I mean, I'll give you one example. Bzovio, the his name's actually Bzowski. The Polish church historian has like 5 pages in his sequel to Baronius's Annales Ecclesiasticae, and that's just not accessible to people because it's in Latin. It's in very poorly scanned editions from the 1600s. So we want to try and bring that to people, and we've got some things sort of very close to being published now, through, well, we haven't signed the contract just yet, but we'll make sure to announce it when we do. So we really think that it would be worthwhile for people to support us, to support the promulgation of a cause. We hear a lot today about holy men, holy women, and women in the world, men in the world, what have you. Sanctity is a palpable thing, and I think we see it in the life and the death and the engagement of Savonarola. And we want to see him canonized because he is really a model for our times. He's a model of what you do when the whole world is going sort of pagan. He's a model for what you do when even the hierarchy in Rome is trying to shut you down, to end, the good work that you're doing, trying to corrupt it. I think really he would be a model for this current age of the church, as well as being sort of the picture of a devoted father in religion, a devoted son of St. Dominic. I mean, he inspired so many saints. Even just this year, the announcement came that Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati is going to be canonized. Pier Giorgio Frassati took the name Girolamo when he became a Third Order member of the Dominican Order, in honor of Savonarola, who he'd gotten to love through reading some of the literature that came out of the University of Turin in the sort of 1920s, 1930s. And so there's a very strong history of venerating Savanarola, and we'd love it if people would be able to help us bring the knowledge of this, wonderful figure, this genius theologian, this, very kind, very devoted, but also very stern, saintly figure to more and more people, because I think his particular message, his particular charism, his particular life is one worth emphasizing, one worth studying. And so, yeah, I really encourage people to come and join us on this journey. If you become a paid patron, you get, as well as access to the bi-weekly material that we translate, we publish. You'll also have the opportunity to receive prayer cards. You'll be able to get in contact with those of us who are running the project. You'll be able to get early access to books. Well, all the information is available on there. So I do really recommend people go read it, go look into it, and consider joining us. And firstly, the first thing that we need is prayers, because nothing can get done without prayer. But we would encourage people to subscribe, and we also, it's a big project, and if there are people who would be willing to finance at a higher level, maybe funding a particular set of sermons, of writings that particularly interest them, we encourage you to get in contact with us as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this presentation today. And I came in pretty much knowing nothing about Savanarola, but now I see why you guys think this is an important cause. And it's good to see also, as you mentioned, there's all these saints and popes who have supported him in the past. So it's not like this is some project of disobedience to the church or something like
No,
that, like some
exactly.
people have.
Yeah, I mean, and ultimately, we want to do what we're doing, not because we have necessarily a particular attachment, but for the good of the church. And we think that we're attached to Savanarola as somebody whose only care in life was for the church and for her own interests. I would like to sort of end on a quote from the late Father John O'Neill, who wrote a very well-known set of 2 books examining. One was a biography of Savonarola, which is very good, a very good read, and the second was about the excommunication and how it was invalid. And he ends his first book, Jerome Savonarola, a sketch, saying this: "It may be that Savonarola's name will never be placed on the calendar of saints. In heavenly glory, we believe that he enjoys the beatific vision, for, mindful of the saints who sinned and repented, and applying to him the oft-quoted words of St. Augustine touching on St. Cyprian of Carthage, if he had faults wherewith to reproach himself regarding his conduct to the Pope, he has fully expiated them by his martyrdom. We may claim that blood and fire washed away whatever stain may have tarnished a career so pure and illustrious." And I think, our hope is that we may one day see him raised to the altars, but we want to do this to recuperate his good name and primarily to glorify Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Maybe one last objection I might bring up to his canonization, which I hear a lot, is that he was overly morally rigorous, right? So sort of a classic example of this is the burning of the art. And a lot of people say he just went too far in it with burning a whole bunch of art and stuff. How would you respond to an objection like that?
Well, I don't think it's a particularly credible one, in truth. I mean, the vanities that people go on about, they act like he ransacked, the Uffizi Gallery and burned every painting. It's nonsense. San Marco, before, during, and after his reign, was well known for being a center of the arts. I mean, Fra Angelico, Blessed Fra Angelico, was a friar at San Marco. Blessed Fra Angelico had already painted all of his famous frescoes across the monastery, and some of them are, a bit weird, floating hands, floating heads, that sort of thing. If Savonarola were completely this Philistine that people have accused him of being, he would have whitewashed everything and covered it up. But it's silly. I mean, 2 of his greatest devotees were Botticelli and Michelangelo. And if Michelangelo didn't think that Savonarola was against him, I don't know why we should think that he would be against him. Botticelli did burn some of his sketches in the Bonfire of the Vanities, it's true. But that was his free choice. He took them out. It's reported that he ran into his sort of sketching room and took out the prints that he wanted to burn after hearing the sermon of Savonarola, because he was convicted in his heart. And, Savonarola did not send people, into people's houses like he's accused of doing. And the majority of the Bonfire of the Vanities was not precious paintings. It wasn't, irreparable works of art. It was women's makeup. It was gowns for dancing. It was basically anything, it was hand mirrors and fans and things that people felt had become obstacles in their own spiritual lives. had become objects of vanity, had helped them to foster vanity, um, or immorality, in Florence. And the idea that somehow Savonarola was different from St. Bernardine. I mean, St. Bernardine came into Florence and he called it, the mother of harlots, the queen of the sodomites. St. Bernardine exhorted Florence to repent or it would be completely destroyed. On that, the great Franciscan and the great Dominican are completely, united. And the same sort of people who will say Savonarola was overly rigid, he was too harsh. We'll try to compare him with St. Philip Neri, and they'll say, look, see, Savonarola failed because he was too harsh, whereas St. Philip Neri succeeded because he was, all sort of light and bubbly. But that's not true. St. Philip Neri could be very stern when he wanted to. He wasn't afraid to tell people that they were going to die in their sins. He wasn't afraid of rebuking people. St. Philip Neri's character was different from Savonarola's, it's true. But St. Philip Neri himself never saw their methods, their missions as contradictory to each other. St. Philip Neri never compared himself to Savonarola and said, Savonarola bad, me good. He was always devoted to Savonarola. He called him, the teacher of our morals. And I think that speaks much more than any sort of silly accusation of being too rigorous or too. I mean, I'll give you another example. Savonarola was very close friends with Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and later on, Marsilio Ficino became a sort of defender of the friar. Ficino is so because he wrote under the influence of the Medici a tract against Savonarola, which is just a screed. It's a terrible read, but these people were not known for necessarily being the most 100% orthodox of believers. Pico was a sort of condemned heretic, and yet he still wrote to them. He still considered them friends. He, in a very famous letter, actually, to one of his Dominican novices, who was very advanced in the spiritual life and was living in not San Marco, but one of the daughter convents. Savonarola urged him to be patient. He urged him to not think himself above the other friars. To say, he told him, "You've got a special grace. Be humble, be patient, be kind to the others, because then they're maybe not as far as advanced as you." And I think that's much more his character than an overly harsh, overly judgmental, rigoristic caricature, because it's all caricature at the end of the day. And even when it's not caricature, it's mostly ignorance, because like I've mentioned, he's so little known in the English-speaking world that that a lot of people, if they've heard of him, which most people haven't, let's face it, if they've heard of him, they're usually operating under a sort of mid-19th century Protestant idea of him, which is that he's a pre-Protestant reformer and at best a proto-Luther, and at worst, a proto-Calvin with all the rigor and none of the refinement, I suppose. But no.
Yeah.
So my response is that Savonarola was a patron of the arts. He was a poet himself. He composed poems all throughout his career up until his death. He was a very learned man. He was a lover of Petrarch. He was a lover of Fra Angelico. He was close with Botticelli. His works have been put to music by William Byrd, by Orlando Lassus. If he were so inimical to the spirit of art, he would not have inspired so much and done so much of it himself. So
yeah, it makes a lot of sense. This is one last question. The very beginning of your thing, you mentioned he actually published a book on logic. And I'm curious if there's anything interesting there, if it's sort of a standard, like Aristotelian logic textbook.
Well, more or less, it's just
Mhm.
because it was a textbook that he devised for the teaching of novices, over at Ferrara and then at Bologna. So there are some unique insights into it, but it's very much a standard sort of late medieval Thomist manual of logic. Yes, Savonarola as a philosopher is actually quite ignored. People tend to focus on the big stuff, the prophecies, the, the theology, and we tend to miss some of the scriptural commentaries, the less grandiose sermons, the letters, the poems. So it's a shame, but hopefully what we're doing can bring more of the lesser known writings to light.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Right. And thank you everyone for watching.
Yes, thank you.